The large event hall of the Lone Star Veterans Association in San Antonio hummed with the low murmur of conversation. Men and women in various stages of formal dress mingled around circular tables draped in white linen. Some wore their dress uniforms adorned with ribbons and medals that caught the light as they moved. Others wore suits or dresses, their military service, evident only in their bearing or the small pins on their lapels. Mason Sullivan stood at the edge of the room, a tumbler of whiskey untouched in his hand. At 47, his 6-foot frame remained solid despite the years that had passed since active duty. His dark hair had started graying at the temples, adding a distinguished quality that matched the intensity in his blue eyes. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit well enough, but felt foreign compared to the uniforms that had defined so much of his life. "You ready for this, Steele?" A man in his 50s approached, clapping Mason on the shoulder. The nickname brought a slight smile to Mason's face. Few people called him that anymore. Steele Sullivan, a moniker earned during his time commanding an M1 Abrams tank in Iraq and Afghanistan. The name had stuck throughout his military career, an identity that sometimes felt more real than the civilian he'd become. "As ready as I'll ever be, Senator," Mason replied, shaking the man's hand. Senator Robert Harding had been a colonel when Mason first met him, commanding the battalion during Mason's first deployment. Now the man represented Texas in Washington and had personally invited Mason to speak at the annual Veterans Gala. "These folks need to hear your story," Harding said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Especially the young officers. Too many of them think leadership is about giving orders and looking good on paper." Mason nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. What part of his story did they need to hear? The triumphant moments of precision and courage under fire? Or the dark nights filled with doubt and fear? The pride of leading men in combat? Or the cost of those decisions that still haunted him? Before he could respond, the evening's master of ceremonies approached the podium, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please take your seats, we're about to begin our program." Mason made his way to the head table, passing groups of veterans who nodded in recognition. Some he knew personally, others knew him only by reputation. The weight of their expectations settled on his shoulders as he took his seat. The ceremony progressed with practiced military precision. The presentation of colors, the national anthem, recognition of distinguished guests. Mason listened with half an ear, his mind drifting back to another time, another place, to hot desert winds and the smell of diesel, to the thunderous roar of the Abrams 120mm main gun, to the faces of his crew, trusting him to bring them home. "And now it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker." Senator Harding's voice pulled Mason back to the present. "A man whose service to our country spans 3 combat deployments with the 1st Armored Brigade Combat Team. As a tank commander, he led from the front in some of the most intense fighting our troops faced in Iraq and Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome retired Captain Mason Steele Sullivan." The applause washed over him as Mason rose and approached the podium. He adjusted the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces, some young, eager, untested. Others weathered and knowing, carrying the same invisible burdens he did. "Thank you, Senator," Mason began, his deep voice steady despite the tumult of emotions beneath the surface. "It's an honor to be here among so many who have served our nation." He paused, setting aside the speech he had prepared. Something about the moment called for honesty rather than polished rhetoric. "I wasn't always destined for military service," he continued, surprising himself with this admission. "In fact, for much of my youth, I actively tried to avoid it." A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't how these speeches typically began. "My father, James Sullivan, commanded an M60 Patton during Desert Storm. My grandfather fought in Patton's Third Army across Europe in World War II. The Sullivan men have answered America's call for generations." Mason's eyes found an elderly man near the back who nodded in solemn understanding. "But I wanted something different, something that was mine, not inherited. I didn't want to live in anyone's shadow. I was determined to forge my own path." Mason leaned against the podium, his voice taking on a reflective quality. "I was a college junior at Texas A&M, studying engineering and planning a future in the private sector when September 11th happened. I remember standing in my apartment, watching those towers fall. I remember the silence afterward, the shock, the anger. The room was utterly still now. Every person present transported back to that moment that had changed a generation. I enlisted the next day. Not because of family tradition, not because I suddenly discovered some latent patriotism. Mason looked down for a moment, then back up at the audience. I enlisted because for the first time in my life, I understood viscerally what my father and grandfather had known all along. That some things are worth fighting for. That freedom isn't free, that sometimes history calls your name and you have to answer. As Mason continued his speech, his mind drifted back to those early days, to the beginning of his journey that would lead him to become the man standing at the podium today. The ROTC building at Texas A&M University hadn't changed much since his father's time. The same faded photographs lined the walls, images of former cadets who had gone on to distinguished military careers. Mason had walked past those pictures hundreds of times in his 3 years at the university, barely giving them a glance. Now, in the days following 9/11, he found himself studying the faces, wondering if he would one day join their ranks. Sullivan! The sharp voice of Captain Reynolds, the ROTC instructor, broke through his thoughts. You're up next on the simulator. Mason nodded, following the captain into a room where a rudimentary tank simulator had been set up. It wasn't much, nothing like the advanced training systems they used at actual military bases, but it was enough to teach the basics. Your father was one of the best tank commanders I ever served with, Reynolds said as Mason settled into the commander's position. He had an instinct for the battlefield that can't be taught. Mason fought back a flare of irritation. There it was again, the shadow he couldn't escape. James Sullivan, the decorated tank commander. The hero of 73 Easting, one of the most lopsided tank battles in modern warfare. I'm not my father, Mason said, more sharply than he intended. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. No, you're not, he agreed, at least not yet. But you've got the same foundation, the same potential. What you do with it is up to you. 6 months later, Mason stood in formation at Fort Knox, Kentucky, the home of the U.S. Army Armor School. The late spring sun beat down on the new lieutenants as they waited for their branch assignments. Mason had excelled in his training, finishing near the top of his class, but excellence was expected of a Sullivan. It wasn't enough to stand out. When I call your name, step forward and receive your assignment, the colonel announced, holding a clipboard. Adams, infantry; Baker, logistics; Collins, artillery. The names continued, each cadet stepping forward to receive their future. Mason stood straight, his face betraying nothing of the turmoil inside him. He had applied for armor, not because it was expected, but because something in him had responded to the power and precision of armored warfare. The strategic chess game of maneuver and firepower. Sullivan armor? Mason stepped forward, accepted his orders with a crisp salute, and returned to formation. It was done. He was following in his father's tracks after all, but he would do it his way. He would make his own name, forge his own legacy. The training that followed was grueling, designed to break down civilians and build up soldiers. Physical conditioning that pushed the body to its limits. Classroom instruction on tactics, equipment, and leadership. And finally, the moment Mason had been working toward, his first encounter with the M1 Abrams, the main battle tank of the U.S. Army. The tank sat on the training grounds, 68 tons of American engineering and firepower. Its angular turret and long gun barrel gave it an aggressive profile. The desert tan paint job was still pristine, unmarked by the dust and grime of actual combat. She's a beast, said the instructor, a sergeant with 15 years of experience. But treat her right, and she'll keep you alive when everything else is trying to kill you. Mason circled the vehicle, taking in its dimensions, its features. The Abrams was a quantum leap beyond the tanks his father and grandfather had commanded. Composite armor that could withstand most enemy fire. A 120mm smoothbore main gun that could accurately hit targets over 2 miles away. A gas turbine engine that could push the behemoth to speeds of over 40 mph on open ground. You'll be assigned to your crew tomorrow, the sergeant continued. 4 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver. You'll eat together, train together, eventually fight together. They become more than your team. They become your family. Family. The word resonated with Mason in ways the sergeant couldn't have intended. His actual family had been fractured for years. His father, still serving as a colonel at the Pentagon, remained a distant figure of authority rather than warmth. His mother had passed away from cancer when Mason was 16, leaving a void that had never been filled. And his younger brother David had chosen a completely different path, becoming a doctor and settling in California. The next morning, Mason met the 3 men who would form his tank crew. They gathered in a small classroom, eyeing each other with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "I'm Lieutenant Mason Sullivan," he introduced himself, deliberately leaving out any mention of his family's military history. "I'll be your tank commander." "Eddie Rodriguez," said a compact Hispanic man with quick, intelligent eyes. "Gunner. 3 years experience with the Bradley fighting vehicle, but this is my first assignment with the Abrams." Mike Thompson, a tall, broad-shouldered African-American, nodded. "Everyone calls me Wrench, system maintainer. This is my second tour with the armor. Spent 4 years with the 1st Cavalry Division." The last man was younger than the others, with a boyish face that made him look barely out of high school. "Tommy Martinez, sir, loader. This is my first assignment after basic." Mason nodded, studying each man's face, committing their details to memory. These men would be relying on him to make the right decisions in combat, decisions that could mean life or death. "We've got 8 weeks to become the best tank crew in the battalion," Mason said. "It won't be easy, but when we deploy, we need to be able to trust each other with our lives." The men nodded, their expressions serious. They all knew what was coming. The invasion of Iraq was imminent, and the 1st Armored Brigade would likely be among the first conventional forces to cross the border. Their training began immediately. Days spent learning every inch of their Abrams, designated Thunderbolt in honor of the 37th Armor Regiment's nickname. Nights spent studying tactics and maintenance procedures. They practiced loading and firing the main gun until the movements became fluid, automatic. They ran drills for every conceivable emergency: engine failure, ammunition fire, enemy ambush. Through it all, Mason drove them hard, pushed them to excel, not because he was trying to prove something, though that motivation lurked beneath the surface, but because excellence might save their lives when theory became reality. 2 weeks into their training, Mason encountered the first real challenge to his authority. The battalion was conducting a field exercise, simulating combat conditions. Thunderbolt was advancing through rough terrain when a voice came over the radio. "Thunderbolt, this is Warhorse 6. The voice belonged to Sergeant First Class Frank Miller, the platoon sergeant and a veteran of Desert Storm. "You're out of position. Adjust course 15 degrees east." Mason checked his map and the GPS. "Negative, Warhorse 6. We're exactly where we should be according to the operation order." There was a pause, then Miller's voice came back, harder. "Lieutenant, I've been doing this since you were in elementary school. Adjust your course now." Mason felt his crew's eyes on him, waiting for his response. This was more than a disagreement about navigation. It was a test of his leadership. "With respect, Sergeant Miller, the order places us on this approach vector for a reason. It provides better cover and fields of fire for our advance. We're staying on course." The radio was silent for a long moment. Finally, Miller responded, "Your call, Lieutenant. We'll see how it plays out." The exercise continued, with Thunderbolt maintaining its original course. When they crested a ridge, they had a perfect firing position on the enemy forces, exactly as Mason had predicted. They scored multiple hits before the opposing force could effectively respond. Afterward, as the crews were performing maintenance on their vehicles, Miller approached Mason. The sergeant was in his early 40s, with a weathered face and the hard eyes of a man who had seen combat up close. "Not bad, Lieutenant," Miller said, his tone neutral, "though sometimes the book answer isn't the right answer in the real world." Mason wiped grease from his hands. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it wasn't the book answer. It was the right tactical decision for the terrain and situation." Miller studied him for a moment. "You know, I served with your father in Desert Storm." Of course he had. Mason kept his expression carefully neutral, waiting for the inevitable comparison. "He was a hell of a tank commander," the Miller continued. "Fearless, decisive, his men would have followed him into hell." "I'm not my father," Mason said, the words coming automatically after years of making the same declaration. "No, you're not," Miller agreed, echoing Captain Reynolds' words from months earlier. "He earned his reputation. You haven't earned yours yet." The sergeant turned to go, then paused. "The men in this platoon need a commander who'll bring them home, Lieutenant. Not someone trying to live up to or outdo his daddy's ghost." Mason watched him walk away, anger and frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. Miller didn't understand. No one did. This wasn't about living up to his father's legacy or outshining it. It was about becoming his own man, forging his own path. But as he turned back to Thunderbolt, he wondered if perhaps the sergeant had seen something in him that he hadn't been willing to acknowledge. Was he making decisions based on what was best for his crew, or was he unconsciously competing with the legend of James Sullivan? The question lingered as their training intensified. The possibility of deployment loomed larger with each passing day. News reports showed the buildup of American forces in Kuwait. Political tensions escalated. The clock was ticking toward invasion. Through it all, Mason and his crew continued to improve, to coalesce as a unit. Eddie Rodriguez proved to be a natural gunner with an instinctive feel for the Abrams fire control system. Mike Thompson knew the tank system so thoroughly that he could diagnose most problems by sound alone. And young Tommy Martinez gained strength and confidence as he mastered the loader's physically demanding role. They weren't just a crew anymore. They were becoming the family the sergeant had promised. They shared meals, stories, dreams, and fears. Rodriguez talked about his girlfriend back in Texas, how they planned to get married after his deployment. Thompson showed pictures of his 2 kids, pride evident in his voice. Martinez, just 19, spoke of being the first in his family to serve, how his parents had initially opposed his enlistment but had come to accept his choice. Mason shared less, maintaining some distance as their commanding officer. But in the late hours after training, when fatigue lowered barriers, he found himself opening up more than he had intended. About his mother's death from cancer, about his complicated relationship with his father, about his desire to serve honorably while establishing his own identity. Family legacies can be a bitch, Thompson commented one night as they sat cleaning their personal weapons. My old man was a mechanic too, worked on the assembly line for Ford for 30 years. Expected me to follow him there. What happened? Mason asked. Thompson grinned. I joined the Army instead. Figured if I was going to get my hands dirty, might as well be working on something that matters. My parents wanted me to be a doctor, Martinez chimed in. Or a lawyer. Something respectable, you know? When I told them I was enlisting, my mom cried for 3 days. And now, Rodriguez asked? Now they've got an American flag in their front window and tell all the neighbors their son is serving his country. Martinez's smile was both proud and slightly embarrassed. Mason listened to their stories, envying the simplicity of their rebellions and reconciliations. His own path felt more complex, more burdened by history and expectation. The day finally came in January 2003, when their battalion commander called them together for an announcement that had been inevitable for months. Ladies and gentlemen, it's official, Colonel Westbrook said, his voice carrying across the assembly area where the entire battalion stood in formation. We deploy to Kuwait in 3 weeks. From there, we'll likely be part of the main invasion force into Iraq. A ripple of tension passed through the formation. This was what they had trained for, what they had prepared themselves to face. But the reality of imminent combat brought the stakes into sharp focus. This won't be like Desert Storm, the colonel continued, his eyes sweeping across the ranks. We're not just pushing the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. We're going all the way to Baghdad this time. The fighting will be intense. The conditions will be harsh. But you are the finest armored force in the world, and you will prevail. As they were dismissed to begin preparation for deployment, Mason felt a curious mixture of apprehension and anticipation. This was it, the moment when training ended and the real test began. Lieutenant Sullivan, a voice called as Mason was heading back to the barracks. He turned to see Colonel Westbrook gesturing for him to approach. Sir, Mason said, coming to attention. At ease, Westbrook said. I wanted to have a quick word with you before things get too hectic. The colonel was a tall man with graying hair at his temples, his uniform immaculate as always. He had a reputation for being tough, but fair. A commander who demanded excellence but recognized effort. Your platoon has consistently outperformed the others in training exercises, Westbrook said. Sergeant Miller tells me that's largely due to your leadership. Mason couldn't hide his surprise. Sergeant Miller said that, sir? Westbrook smiled slightly. He did, though I suspect it wasn't easy for him to admit. Frank doesn't give praise lightly, especially to new officers. Thank you, sir. We have worked hard to be ready. I know you have. That's why I'm giving your platoon point position when we cross the border. You'll be leading the battalion's advance. Mason felt a surge of pride followed immediately by the weight of responsibility. Point position meant they would be the first to encounter enemy forces, the first to draw fire. We won't let you down, sir, he said, his voice firm despite the churning in his stomach. I know you won't, Westbrook replied. He paused, then added, your father will be proud. Mason nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Of course his father would be mentioned. Of course his achievement would be seen in relation to James Sullivan's legacy. As the colonel walked away, Mason stood alone for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he headed toward the motor pool, where Thunderbolt waited. His crew needed to know about their assignment. They needed to prepare. They had 3 weeks to be ready for the greatest test of their lives. 3 weeks to prepare for the realities of combat. 3 weeks before theory became practice, and training faced the ultimate evaluation. The desert night was cold as Mason stood outside his tent in Camp New Jersey, Kuwait. Stars spangled the black sky overhead, countless and brilliant in the clear desert air. Around him, the massive encampment of the 1st Armored Brigade hummed with activity even at this late hour. Soldiers making final preparations, mechanics performing last-minute checks on vehicles, officers reviewing battle plans. In less than 12 hours, they would cross the border into Iraq. Intelligence reports indicated minimal resistance initially, but no one was taking anything for granted. Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard might be waiting in strength further north. Chemical weapons were a constant concern, with all personnel trained in rapid response to CBRN alerts. Mason's satellite phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, checking the caller ID before answering. "Hello, sir," he said, his voice formal, despite the familial connection. Mason, his father's voice came through clearly, despite the thousands of miles between them. Colonel James Sullivan was calling from the Pentagon, where he served on the Joint Staff. "I just got word your unit is moving out tomorrow." "Yes, sir. First thing in the morning." There was a pause, the silence heavy with all the things neither of them quite knew how to say. They had never been good at this, at bridging the gap that had formed after Mason's mother died. Military protocol had become a substitute for emotional intimacy, a framework they both understood when the language of father and son failed them. "Your unit has good equipment, good leadership," his father finally said. "Colonel Westbrook is one of the best." "He is," Mason agreed, waiting for what he knew would come next. "I've reviewed your battle plan. Your platoon is taking point." His father's tone remained professional, analytical. "It's a good position, gives you tactical flexibility, but be careful of being too far forward without adequate support. Always the commander, always the strategist." Even now, even in what should be a personal conversation, James Sullivan couldn't help but assess and advise. "We've trained for this, sir. We're ready." Another pause. "I know you are." His father's voice softened slightly. "Your mother would be proud, Mason, as am I." The words caught Mason off guard. His father rarely spoke of his mother, and almost never expressed pride in such direct terms. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "Thank you, sir," he managed finally. "That means a lot." "Just come home safe," his father said, the professional tone returning. "That's an order, Lieutenant." Despite himself, Mason smiled. "Yes, sir, I'll do my best to comply." After the call ended, Mason remained outside looking up at the stars. The conversation had been brief, stilted in many ways, but something in it had steadied him. For all their differences, for all the complicated history between them, his father understood what he was about to face in a way few others could. He headed back to his tent, where his 3 crew members were making their own final preparations. Thompson was methodically checking his personal weapon, field stripping and reassembling it with practiced ease. Rodriguez sat on his cot, writing what was probably a letter to his girlfriend. Martinez was the only one sleeping, his young face relaxed in a way it wouldn't be again for many months. "Everything good with the brass, LT?" Thompson asked, looking up from his work. "All good," Mason confirmed. "Just a call from back home." He didn't elaborate, and Thompson didn't push. They all had their private concerns, their personal connections to the world they were temporarily leaving behind. Tomorrow, those would have to be set aside. Tomorrow, only the mission would matter. Mason lay on his cot, staring at the canvas ceiling, willing sleep to come. His mind raced with contingencies, with the details of their battle plan, with the countless variables that could mean success or failure, life or death. For the first time since training began, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of command, the responsibility for the lives of his crew and the success of their mission. He had wanted to forge his own path, to step out of his father's shadow. Tomorrow he would have that chance. Tomorrow he would lead men into combat for the first time. Sleep came eventually, fitful and filled with dreams of desert sand and fire. Dawn broke harsh and bright over the Kuwaiti desert. Mason stood beside Thunderbolt as his crew performed their final checks. The massive Abrams tank, freshly painted in desert tan, looked both powerful and vulnerable in the morning light. A machine of tremendous capability, yet still just a machine, dependent on the men who operated it. "Systems check complete, all green," Thompson reported, closing an access panel on the turret. "Ammunition loaded and secured," Martinez added, wiping sweat from his brow despite the early hour. Fire control systems calibrated and operational, Rodriguez confirmed from his position at the gunner station. Mason nodded, performing his own visual inspection of the exterior. Thunderbolt was as ready as they could make her. Now it was time to see if they were equally prepared. The order to mount up came over the radio at precisely 0600. Mason climbed up the side of the tank and dropped into the commander's cupola, securing the hatch above him. Inside, the Abrams was cramped but organized, every control and display exactly where it needed to be for maximum efficiency in combat. "Comms check," he ordered, adjusting his headset. "Gunner check," Rodriguez responded immediately. "Loader check," came Martinez's voice, slightly higher with tension. "Driver check," Thompson confirmed from his position at the front of the tank. "Thunderbolt is operational and ready," Mason reported to platoon command. Around them, the other 3 tanks of their platoon were going through the same process, their commanders reporting readiness in sequence. "All units, this is Warhorse 6. Sergeant Miller's voice came over the platoon frequency. "Prepare to move out. Maintain formation and spacing. Keep your eyes open and your heads down." The massive column of armor began to move. Hundreds of vehicles, from tanks to Bradley, fighting vehicles to support trucks, all heading toward the Iraqi border. Thunderbolt took its position at the point of the spear, the lead vehicle of the lead platoon of the lead company. As they approached the border, Mason felt a curious calm settle over him. The months of training, the years of preparation, had all led to this moment. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. Not as James Sullivan's son, but as Lieutenant Mason Sullivan, commander of Thunderbolt. "Border crossing in 2 minutes," he informed his crew. "Stay sharp." The line in the sand that separated Kuwait from Iraq was more conceptual than physical, but crossing it represented a momentous step nonetheless. They were entering hostile territory, beginning a campaign that would reshape the Middle East in their own lives in ways none of them could fully anticipate. 30 seconds, Mason counted down. 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thunderbolt crossed the border, its massive treads leaving deep impressions in the Iraqi sand. They were in. The first hours of the invasion proved anticlimactic. The Iraqi military presence along the southern border was minimal, with most forces having withdrawn northward to defend more strategic positions. Thunderbolt and the rest of the platoon encountered no resistance as they pushed forward at a steady pace, eating up miles of desert terrain. "This is too easy," Rodriguez commented as they entered their 3rd hour without incident. "Where is everybody?" "Getting ready for us further north," Thompson replied from the driver's position. "They're not going to waste forces trying to stop us here." Mason kept his attention divided between the terrain ahead and the tactical display that showed the positions of friendly forces in their area. Everything was proceeding according to plan, almost exactly as they had trained and simulated back at Fort Knox. Then shortly after noon, their luck changed. "Contact front," Rodriguez called out sharply. "Vehicle 2 o'clock, range 3,000 meters. Mason swung his periscope to the indicated position, adjusting the magnification. Through the enhanced optics, he could see a single Iraqi T-72 tank, partially concealed behind a small rise in the terrain. "Confirmed," he said, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "Single enemy tank, appears to be setting up an ambush position." "Request permission to engage," Rodriguez said, his finger already hovering over the fire control. Mason hesitated for a fraction of a second. This would be their first live engagement, the first time Thunderbolt's main gun would fire in combat rather than training. The decision was his. "Warhorse 6, this is Thunderbolt," he radioed to the platoon command. "We have visual on enemy armor, requesting permission to engage." "Thunderbolt, Warhorse 6, Miller responded immediately. "You are cleared hot. Take the shot." "Gunner, heat round enemy tank," Mason ordered, using the standard fire command format. "Heat up," Martinez confirmed as he loaded the high-explosive anti-tank round into the breech. "Target acquired," Rodriguez reported, his voice calm and professional as he aligned the sophisticated fire control system on the distant Iraqi tank. "Fire when ready," Mason commanded. Rodriguez pressed the trigger. The Abrams shuddered as its 120mm main gun roared, sending the heat round downrange at over a mile per second. The sound inside the tank was deafening, despite their communication headsets. "Target hit," Rodriguez called out as the round found its mark, striking the T-72 just below its turret. The Iraqi tank erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that sent its turret cartwheeling into the air. "Good shot," Mason acknowledged, scanning the area for additional threats. Stay alert. Where there's one, there may be more. Indeed, within minutes, they spotted two more Iraqi tanks attempting to maneuver to their flank. Mason directed Thunderbolt to a hold-down position behind a small ridge, giving them protection while maintaining their firing capability. The next few minutes were a blur of action. Rodriguez destroyed the second tank with another perfectly placed shot. The third attempted to retreat but was caught in the open by one of the other tanks in the platoon. Just as they were preparing to advance again, a new threat emerged. "RPG team, 9 o'clock!" Thompson shouted, spotting the infantry anti-tank team before anyone else. Mason swiveled to see 3 Iraqi soldiers setting up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher less than 100 meters away, having somehow infiltrated close to their position while they were focused on the tank threat. "Coax," he ordered, referring to the coaxial machine gun mounted alongside the main gun. Rodriguez immediately switched to the machine gun and opened fire, but not before the RPG team got off a shot. The rocket streaked toward Thunderbolt, striking the front glacis plate at an angle. The tank's composite armor did its job, deflecting most of the explosion, but the impact was still jarring. "Status report," Mason demanded as the echo of the explosion faded. "Systems operational," Thompson confirmed after checking his displays. "Minimal damage to external sensors." "RPG team neutralized," Rodriguez reported, having continued firing until the threat was eliminated. "Everyone okay?" Mason asked, checking on his crew personally. "All good, LT," Martinez assured him, though his voice had a slight tremble that hadn't been there before. The young loader had just experienced combat for the first time, had just witnessed men die under their fire. Mason took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was what they had trained for, but no training could fully prepare you for the reality of combat, for making split-second decisions that ended lives and saved others. "Thunderbolt, this is Warhorse 6, Miller's voice came over the radio. "Report status." "Warhorse 6, Thunderbolt is operational," Mason responded. 3 enemy tanks destroyed, 1 RPG team neutralized. No casualties, minimal damage. "Good work," Miller acknowledged, and Mason thought he detected a note of approval in the sergeant's usually gruff voice. "Maintain position and prepare to support the infantry advance." As the adrenaline of their first engagement began to subside, Mason took a moment to check their ammunition status and assess their tactical situation. They had performed well, had faced their first test and passed, but this was just the beginning. The road to Baghdad would be long and fraught with dangers they could only dimly anticipate. 3 days into the invasion, Thunderbolt and its crew had settled into the rhythm of combat operations. They had engaged multiple enemy vehicles, supported infantry assaults, and maintained their position at the spearhead of the battalion's advance. The resistance had been lighter than expected, with many Iraqi regular army units surrendering rather than facing the overwhelming American firepower. But as they pushed deeper into Iraq, the fighting intensified. The Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's elite forces, put up stiffer resistance, employing more sophisticated tactics and showing greater willingness to stand and fight. On the 4th day, disaster struck. Thunderbolt was leading the platoon through a narrow valley when Thompson noticed something wrong with the engine. "Temperature spiking," he reported, his voice tense as he monitored the gauges. "We're losing power." "Can you diagnose?" Mason asked, immediately alert to the potential danger. A disabled tank in hostile territory was vulnerable, a stationary target for enemy fire. Thompson ran through a series of diagnostic checks, his expertise with the Abrams systems evident in the speed and precision of his actions. "Coolant leak, possibly from enemy fire we took yesterday. The damage must have been internal." "Can we make it to the rally point?" Mason asked, referring to their designated fallback position about 5 kilometers away. Thompson shook his head. "Negative. If we keep pushing the engine, we're looking at catastrophic failure in less than a kilometer." Mason made a quick decision. "Pull off to that defensive position at 2 o'clock. We'll assess from there." He radioed their situation to Sergeant Miller, who acknowledged and informed him that the rest of the platoon would continue the advance, while a recovery vehicle was dispatched to their position. It would be at least 3 hours before help arrived. Thunderbolt limped to the indicated position, a small rise that offered some cover and good fields of fire if they needed to defend themselves. As soon as they stopped, Thompson was out of the driver's hatch, tools in hand, to assess the damage more directly. "It's bad, LT," he reported after a thorough examination. "Main coolant line is ruptured. I can patch it temporarily, but we're not going anywhere under our own power." Mason nodded, processing this information and its implications. They were effectively stranded in hostile territory, their 68-ton vehicle reduced to an elaborate pillbox. They had ammunition, communications, and defensive capabilities, but they were immobile and isolated. Establish a perimeter, he ordered. Rodriguez, maintain watch from the turret. Martinez, you and I will set up defensive positions on the ground. Thompson, do what you can with the engine. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, each man understanding the seriousness of their situation. Martinez, despite being the youngest and least experienced, showed no hesitation as he helped Mason set up their personal weapons in a defensive arrangement around the tank. You think we'll see action, sir? The young loader asked as they worked. Mason considered the question honestly. It's possible. We're behind the main advance now, but there could be Iraqi forces that bypassed our line, or civilians who might report our position. Martinez nodded, checking the magazine in his M4 carbine. We'll be ready if they come. The hours passed slowly. Thompson worked tirelessly on the engine, managing to patch the coolant line, but confirming his initial assessment that they wouldn't be able to move under their own power. The recovery vehicle was delayed, encountering resistance of its own along the route. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape, Mason's radio crackled to life. "Thunderbolt, this is Outlaw 2-1, came a new voice. "We're a 4-man recon team operating in your vicinity. We've received reports of enemy movement near your position." Mason keyed his mic. "Outlaw 2-1, this is Thunderbolt. Can you provide details on enemy composition and direction?" "Approximately squad-size element, light vehicles, heading your way from the northeast. ETA 20 minutes. We're too far out to provide direct support." "Understood, Outlaw. We'll handle it from here. Thunderbolt out." Mason gathered his crew, explaining the situation quickly and concisely. "We've got hostiles inbound, light vehicles, probably technical trucks with mounted weapons. Our armor will protect us from anything they're likely to have, but we need to be ready." "What's the play, LT?" Rodriguez asked, already moving toward his gunner's position. Mason considered their options. With the tank immobile, they couldn't maneuver, but they still had their formidable firepower. "We use Thunderbolt as our strong point. Rodriguez, you're on the main gun. Thompson, take the commander's 50 cal. Martinez and I will provide close-in security with small arms." The men moved to their positions, checking weapons and ammunition. The atmosphere was tense but focused, each man prepared for what was to come. The Iraqi force appeared exactly where the recon team had predicted. 3 pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, accompanied by about a dozen infantry. They approached cautiously, clearly having spotted the disabled American tank but uncertain about its combat status. "Hold fire," Mason ordered. "Let them get closer." He watched through his binoculars as the enemy force spread out, attempting to encircle their position. It was a sound tactical move against a fixed target, but it also divided their firepower. "On my mark," Mason said quietly, waiting until the lead vehicle was within optimal range for the coaxial machine gun. "Now!" Rodriguez opened fire with the Cokes, the 7.62mm rounds tearing into the lead technical. The driver was hit immediately, causing the vehicle to swerve and crash. Thompson followed with the 50 caliber machine gun, targeting the second vehicle with devastating effect. The heavy rounds penetrated the unarmored pickup truck, destroying its engine block and killing or wounding most of its occupants. The third technical attempted to retreat, but Rodriguez switched to the main gun, loading a heat round with Martinez's assistance. The 120mm shell obliterated the vehicle, leaving nothing but burning wreckage. The Iraqi infantry, now without vehicle support, tried to advance on foot, using the terrain for cover. Mason and Martinez engaged them with their M4s from protected positions, forcing them to keep their heads down. "They're flanking left," Thompson called out, swinging the 50 cal to address the new threat. Mason spotted 3 Iraqi soldiers attempting to circle around to their blind spot. He shifted position, taking careful aim with his rifle. 3 controlled pairs of shots, center mass as he'd been trained, 3 enemies down. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, the Iraqi force was decimated, with those still able to move beating a hasty retreat into the gathering darkness. "Status report," Mason called out, checking on his crew. "Gunner operational," Rodriguez confirmed. "Driver good," Thompson reported. Silence from Martinez's position. "Martinez," Mason called, a note of concern in his voice. "Tommy, report." "I'm hit," came the weak response. "Not bad, I think. Arm." Mason moved quickly to the young loader's position, finding him propped against the side of the tank, his left upper arm soaked with blood. A bullet had found a gap in their defensive position, striking Martinez as he was reloading his rifle. "Let me see," Mason said, kneeling beside him and examining the wound. It was a through and through missing bone and major arteries from what he could tell, but still serious enough to require immediate attention. "Thompson, med kit!" The driver was there in seconds, the unit's medical supplies in hand. Together they cleaned and dressed Martinez's wound, administering morphine for the pain and starting an IV to replace lost fluids. "How bad is it, LT?" Martinez asked, his face pale but composed. "You'll live," Mason assured him, finishing the bandage. "Might even get you a Purple Heart and a ticket home for a while." Martinez shook his head weakly. "Rather stay with the unit, sir, with you guys." The simple statement hit Mason harder than he expected. In that moment, he realized just how deeply he had come to care for these men, how the bond formed in training had been tempered and strengthened by combat. They weren't just his crew anymore. They were his responsibility, his brothers in arms. "Rest now," he told Martinez, helping him into a more comfortable position. "We've got you." As night fell completely, Mason organized his remaining crew into a defensive rotation, ensuring that someone was always on watch while the others rested. He took the first shift himself, standing guard as Thompson and Rodriguez got some much-needed sleep. Alone with his thoughts, Mason reflected on the day's events. They had faced their first real crisis as a crew, had fought together against direct assault, had taken their first casualty. Through it all, they had performed admirably, had lived up to their training, and then some. For the first time since joining the military, Mason felt a sense of identity wholly separate from his father's legacy. This was his command, his crew, his battle. Whatever came next, he had proven to himself that he could lead men in combat, could make the hard decisions when lives were on the line. The radio crackled to life, breaking into his thoughts. "Thunderbolt, this is Recovery Actual. We're approximately 30 minutes from your position. What's your status?" Mason keyed his mic. "Recovery Actual, this is Thunderbolt. We're secure but have one wounded. Need medical evacuation for our loader." "Copy that, Thunderbolt. We have a medic with us. Hang tight." Mason looked back at his sleeping crew, at the disabled but undefeated Thunderbolt, at the evidence of the battle they had just won against the odds. They would make it through this. They would continue the advance toward Baghdad. They would complete their mission. But as he settled in for the long night watch, Mason's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message. He checked it, expecting an update from Battalion Command. Instead, it was a text from his brother David. "Call home ASAP. Mom's in hospital. Doctor says it's serious." Mason stared at the screen, the words blurring as their implications sank in. His mother, David, must mean their stepmother, Catherine, who had married his father 3 years after his birth mother died. They weren't close, but she had always been kind to him, had tried to bridge the gap between father and son, even when neither of them made it easy. Now, thousands of miles from home, in the middle of a war zone with a wounded crew member and a disabled tank, Mason faced a new kind of challenge, one that no amount of military training had prepared him for: the conflict between duty to his mission and duty to his family. He looked out into the Iraqi night, the stars obscured by smoke from distant battles. Somewhere out there, the war continued without him, the great machine of the invasion grinding forward toward its objective. And somewhere back home, another kind of battle was being waged, one he could do nothing to influence from here. The weight of command, Moab, and already heavy on his shoulders, grew more burdensome with this new knowledge. Whatever decision he made would come with costs he couldn't fully calculate. Whatever path he chose would leave something valuable behind. Mason Sullivan, tank commander's son, leader of men, stood alone in the desert night, caught between worlds, facing the hardest choice of his life. The choice that would define not just his military career, but the man he was becoming. In the darkness, with only the distant sounds of war as company, he made his decision. For better or worse, it would shape everything that followed. Mason stood in the sterile hospital corridor, the fluorescent lights harsh after weeks under the desert sun. The antiseptic smell reminded him of another hospital, another vigil, years ago when his birth mother lay dying of cancer. Now history seemed to be repeating itself as he stared through the glass at his stepmother Catherine, her body small and frail against the white sheets, machines monitoring her vital signs. He had made it home, barely. The Army had granted him emergency leave after his stepmother's condition deteriorated rapidly. What had started as pneumonia had developed into acute respiratory distress syndrome, her lungs failing despite aggressive treatment. By the time Mason arrived at Walter Reed, she was on a ventilator, unconscious, fighting for each breath. His father stood on the other side of the glass, speaking with a doctor. Colonel James Sullivan looked older than Mason remembered, the lines in his face deeper, his military posture slightly stooped with worry. They had spoken only briefly since Mason's arrival, exchanging information rather than emotions, falling back on their familiar pattern of professional distance. "Lieutenant Sullivan?" Mason turned to see a nurse approaching, her expression sympathetic. "Your father asked me to tell you that he'll be in the consultation room with Dr. Patel for a few minutes. He said you should go in and sit with Catherine if you'd like." Mason nodded his thanks, pushing through the door by all into the ICU room. The sounds enveloped him immediately, the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the subtle clicks and whirs of machinery keeping Catherine alive. He moved to the bedside, taking her limp hand in his. "Hey, Kathy," he said softly, using the nickname only family was allowed. "I made it back." Her face remained still, features slack under the breathing tube. Mason studied her, remembering the first time they'd met 15 years ago. He had been hostile, a teenager still grieving his mother and resenting this woman who seemed to be taking her place. Catherine had responded with patience rather than anger, giving him space while remaining steadfastly kind. Over time, she had earned, if not his love, then his respect and gratitude. "I should have called more," he admitted to her unconscious form. "Should have visited when I had leave, instead of always finding excuses to be elsewhere. I'm sorry for that." The door opened behind him, and he turned to see his father enter alone, his face grave. "What did the doctor say?" Mason asked, already knowing from his father's expression that the news wasn't good. Colonel Sullivan took a deep breath before answering. "Her lungs are failing. The infection isn't responding to antibiotics, and the ventilator is causing additional damage. They're suggesting we consider removing life support." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. End-of-life decisions were clinical in their phrasing, but devastating in their reality. "What do you think we should do?" Mason asked, searching his father's face for guidance. For perhaps the first time in Mason's memory, his father looked uncertain. "I don't know. She wouldn't want to live like this, dependent on machines, but what if there's still a chance?" Mason was struck by the vulnerability in his father's voice. The colonel, the decorated tank commander, the man who had always seemed to have answers for everything, was lost in territory. No amount of tactical training could navigate. "When do we have to decide?" Mason asked. "They're giving us 24 hours to think about it." His father moved to the other side of the bed, taking Catherine's other hand. "I'm glad you're here, Mason. I couldn't make this decision alone." The simple admission touched something deep in Mason. His father had never acknowledged needing him before, had never shown this kind of emotional dependency. It shifted something fundamental in their relationship, creating a bridge across the chasm that had separated them for so long. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in thought, connected by the woman between them and the decision they faced together. Later that night, as Mason tried to sleep in an uncomfortable chair in the hospital waiting room, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was from Fort Hood, where his unit was based before deployment. "Sullivan," he answered, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing the few other people in the waiting room. "Lieutenant, it's Rodriguez." His gunner's voice came through clearly despite the thousands of miles between them. "Eddie, how did you get this number?" Mason asked, surprised to hear from his crew member. "Sergeant Miller gave it to me. Said you'd want to know how things are going." There was a hesitation before Rodriguez continued. "How's your stepmother, sir?" Mason felt a surge of gratitude that his crew was thinking of him while still in the combat zone. "Not good. We're having to make some hard decisions." "I'm sorry to hear that, sir." Rodriguez's voice was genuinely sympathetic. "We're all thinking about you back here." "How's Martinez?" Mason asked, shifting the conversation to his wounded loader. "He's good. Medical evacuated him to Germany, but the doc says he should make a full recovery. They're saying he might even be back with us in a few weeks." "And Thunderbolt?" "Back in action. They replaced the coolant system completely. Thompson's been babying her ever since, making sure everything's perfect for when you get back." Rodriguez paused. "When are you coming back, LT?" The question hung in the air. Mason had been granted 2 weeks of emergency leave, but he hadn't thought beyond getting home to Catherine's bedside. Now, with end-of-life decisions looming, the question of his return to Iraq took on new complexity. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Depends on what happens here." "We've got a temporary replacement," Rodriguez said, a note of loyalty in his voice suggesting the replacement wasn't measuring up to Mason. "But we'll be glad when you're back with us." "How are things going over there?" Mason asked, hungry for information about the war he had temporarily left behind. "We've pushed north. Baghdad fell faster than anyone expected. Now we're dealing with insurgents, IEDs, urban combat, different kind of fight than what we trained for." Rodriguez's voice took on a harder edge. "We lost Parker and his crew 2 days ago. IED took out their tank in Fallujah." Mason closed his eyes, feeling the loss. Lieutenant Parker had been in his ROTC class, had gone through tank commander training with him. "Damn, I'm sorry to hear that." "Yeah." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "It's getting complicated over here, LT. The war's changing, becoming something else. We need good officers more than ever." The subtle message was clear. Mason was needed back in Iraq, needed by his crew, needed by the mission, but he was also needed here, by his father, by Catherine. Duty pulled him in opposite directions, neither choice without cost. "I'll be back as soon as I can," Mason promised. "Take care of yourself and the others until then." "Will do, sir, and Lieutenant, we're all sorry about your stepmother." After the call ended, Mason sat in the dimly lit waiting room, thinking about the parallel worlds he was straddling. In one, life and death played out in a hospital room. In another, the same drama unfolded in the dusty streets of Iraq. Both required his presence. Both demanded decisions he wasn't sure he was equipped to make. The next morning, Mason and his father met with Dr. Patel again. Catherine's condition had worsened overnight, her organs beginning to fail as the infection spread. "Even if she recovers from this acute episode, the damage to her lungs will be permanent," Dr. Patel explained gently. "She would likely require assisted breathing for the rest of her life, with severely limited function." "And the chances of recovery?" Colonel Sullivan asked, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "Given her overall condition, less than 10%, and that would be recovery to a significantly diminished state." The doctor looked between them. "I know this is difficult, but based on medical factors alone, I would recommend transitioning to comfort care." Mason watched his father absorb this information, saw the slight straightening of his spine, the setting of his jaw. The colonel was making a decision, the way he had made countless others throughout his military career. "Catherine and I discussed this possibility years ago," he said finally. "She was explicit that she wouldn't want to be kept alive by machines if there was no reasonable chance of meaningful recovery." He looked at Mason. "What do you think?" The question surprised Mason. His father rarely asked for his opinion, especially on matters of such importance. "I think we should respect her wishes," he said quietly. "She deserves that dignity." Colonel Sullivan nodded, turning back to the doctor. "We'll transition to comfort care, but I want her comfortable. Understand? No suffering." "Of course," Dr. Patel assured them. "We'll make sure she's peaceful. You'll be able to be with her the entire time." The next 12 hours passed in a strange limbo. The ventilator was removed, replaced by oxygen and medication to ease Catherine's breathing. Family members arrived. David flew in from California. Catherine's sister came from Florida. Friends gathered in the waiting room. Mason and his father took turns sitting with her, speaking softly to her unresponsive form, saying goodbye in their own ways. Mason found himself telling her things he had never said when she could hear them. How he appreciated her patience with him as a teenager. How he admired her ability to forge her own place in a family dominated by military tradition. How sorry he was for the times he had kept her at a distance. In the early hours of the morning, with both Mason and his father at her bedside, Catherine Sullivan took her last breath. The monitors flatlined, the alarm silenced quickly by the attending nurse. She was gone. The colonel sat perfectly still, his hands still holding his wife's. Mason had never seen his father cry, not even at his first wife's funeral. He didn't cry now, but something in his rigid posture spoke of a grief beyond tears, a loss that would leave a permanent void. "She loved you, you know," Colonel Sullivan said after a long silence, his eyes still on Catherine's face. "Always said you were the son she never had, worried about you constantly when you deployed." Mason felt a sharp pang of regret. "I should have been a better son to her." His father finally looked at him. "She understood why it was difficult for you, never held it against you." He sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 64 years. "Life gives us so few people who love us unconditionally. I wish I had appreciated that more while she was here." The words weren't just about Catherine, Mason realized. They were about all the relationships his father had neglected in favor of duty, including their own. It was as close to an apology as the colonel had ever offered. They sat together as the medical staff came in to do what needed to be done, united in grief in a way they had never been united in life. The funeral was held 3 days later at Arlington National Cemetery, Catherine being eligible for interment as the spouse of a career military officer. The day was clear and crisp, the ceremonial precision of the honor guard providing structure to the chaos of grief. Mason stood beside his father in his dress uniform, accepting condolences from a long line of military colleagues and family friends. After the last guests had departed, Mason and his father remained at the gravesite, the fresh earth stark against the manicured grass. "I need to return to my unit," Mason said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "My leave is almost up." Colonel Sullivan nodded. "I know, your place is with your men. Will you be okay? I can request an extension." His father shook his head. "I'll be fine. Catherine wouldn't want you to neglect your duty on her account." He looked at Mason directly. "Be careful over there. The situation is deteriorating faster than the Pentagon is willing to admit." "I will." Mason hesitated, then asked, "Any advice? From one tank commander to another?" A ghost of a smile touched his father's lips. "Trust your instincts. Trust your crew. Remember that the mission objective sometimes changes in ways the original orders didn't anticipate." It was more than tactical advice, Mason realized. It was life guidance offered from father to son rather than colonel to lieutenant. "I'll remember that," he promised. They parted with a handshake that turned into a brief, awkward embrace, both men unused to such displays but needing the connection nonetheless. As Mason walked away through the ordered rows of white headstones, he felt the weight of dual responsibilities: to honor Catherine's memory by becoming a better son, and to return to his crew who needed him in the increasingly complex battlefield of Iraq. 2 days later, Mason stood on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base, boarding a military transport that would return him to the war. The grief of Catherine's death traveled with him, a new companion to the concerns and responsibilities of command. But there was something else too, a tentative connection with his father that hadn't existed before, a bridge being built across years of distance. As the massive C-17 lifted off, carrying him away from one set of challenges and toward another, Mason found himself thinking of Thunderbolt and his crew. Rodriguez, Thompson, and soon Martinez again. Men who depended on him, who had formed a kind of family in the crucible of combat. He was returning to them, changed by his time at home, carrying new burdens but also new resolve. The flight to Kuwait was long, giving Mason too much time to think. He reviewed the reports he'd received about the evolving situation in Iraq. The initial phase of the war had ended quickly with the fall of Baghdad and the toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime. But what followed was proving more complex than the military planners had anticipated. An insurgency was taking root, targeting American forces with improvised explosive devices, ambushes, and guerrilla tactics. The tanks that had been so effective in the conventional phase of the war were now vulnerable in urban environments, massive targets for hidden enemies with RPGs and roadside bombs. By the time Mason arrived at the forward operating base near Fallujah, he had mentally prepared himself for a different kind of war than the one he had left. What he wasn't prepared for was the change in his men. Thompson met him at the helicopter landing zone, snapping a crisp salute that quickly gave way to a genuine smile. "Good to have you back, LT." "Good to be back," Mason replied, meaning it despite the circumstances of his return. "How's Thunderbolt?" "Ready for action. We've added some additional armor to the undercarriage. Engineers came up with a modification to help with the IEDs." Thompson led the way toward the vehicle park. "Rodriguez is out on patrol with the new guy, Lieutenant Simmons. They should be back by 1800. "And Martinez?" "Arriving tomorrow. Doctors cleared him for duty last week. Kid's tough, bounced back faster than anyone expected." They reached the tank area where Thunderbolt waited in her parking space. Mason ran a hand along the armored hull, feeling a connection to the machine that had kept them alive through multiple engagements. There were new scars on the exterior, evidence of combat during his absence. "She's seen action while I was gone," he observed. Thompson nodded, his expression darkening. 4 major engagements. Nasty urban fighting in Fallujah. The whole tempo of the war has changed, LT. It's not about maneuver warfare anymore. It's about holding ground, protecting supply routes, dealing with an enemy that melts into the civilian population. Mason heard the strain in Thompson's voice, saw it in the new lines around his eyes. The weeks of combat had taken a toll, not just physically but psychologically. Rodriguez said we lost Parker, Mason said, recalling his conversation from the hospital. Yeah. Thompson's jaw tightened. IED en route Michigan. Blew right through the bottom of the tank. Parker, Wilson, and Jensen died instantly. Roberts survived but lost both legs. He looked away. We've been upgrading our armor ever since, but the insurgents just build bigger bombs. The reality of the evolving conflict was sinking in. This wasn't the war they had trained for, the conventional tank-on-tank battles they had simulated at Fort Knox. This was something new and deadly, requiring adaptation and a different kind of courage. Lieutenant Sullivan, the sharp voice of Sergeant First Class Miller, interrupted their conversation. Welcome back. Mason turned to face the platoon sergeant, noticing subtle changes in the older man as well. Miller moved with the same confidence, but there was a new wariness in his gaze, a hypervigilance born of prolonged exposure to danger. Thank you, Sergeant. I'm ready to resume command of Thunderbolt. Miller studied him for a moment. The situation's changed since you left, Lieutenant. You'll need a full briefing before you go back out. And with respect, you might want to spend some time with Rodriguez and Thompson understanding what we're facing now before you make any decisions. The suggestion that he might not be prepared to lead effectively stung, but Mason recognized the wisdom in Miller's words. I intend to, Sergeant. I have no desire to endanger my crew through ignorance. Miller nodded, apparently satisfied. Briefing with Captain Westbrook at 1900. He'll want to see you before that. And Lieutenant, sorry about your stepmother. The sergeant walked away, leaving Mason slightly surprised by the personal condolence. Perhaps the shared experience of combat was breaking down some of the barriers that had existed between them. He's different, Mason observed to Thompson. We all are, Thompson replied simply. War changes you. Some ways you notice, some you don't until later. Later that evening, after reuniting with Rodriguez and receiving a thorough briefing from Captain Westbrook, Mason sat alone in his quarters, absorbing all he had learned about the new reality they faced. Fallujah had become a hotbed of insurgent activity, a stronghold for forces opposed to the American presence. Intelligence indicated that foreign fighters were flowing into the city, bringing with them experience, weapons, and a jihadist ideology that made them willing to die for their cause. The civilian population was caught in the middle, some supporting the insurgents, others simply trying to survive. Mason's platoon would be part of an operation to clear and hold key neighborhoods, supporting Marine infantry units going house to house. It was dangerous, grinding work, with the constant threat of ambush, IEDs, and sniper fire. Tanks provided vital firepower, but they were also restricted by the narrow streets and the need to minimize civilian casualties. He was still processing this information when there was a knock at his door. Enter, he called, expecting it to be Rodriguez or Thompson with more questions about tomorrow's mission. Instead, it was Sarah, his wife of 5 years, looking as out of place in the military setting as a flower in a desert. She wore civilian clothes, jeans and a simple blouse, with her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the prefab building, she was beautiful. Sarah? Mason stood stunned by her appearance. What are you doing here? Hello, Mason. Her voice was cool, controlled. I'm with the USAID team. We're setting up a civilian infrastructure support program in Fallujah. Mason struggled to process this information. His wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, as their divorce proceedings had begun before his deployment, was here in a war zone without any warning. I didn't know you were involved with USAID, he said, searching for solid conversational ground. There's a lot we don't know about each other anymore. Sarah moved into the room, letting the door close behind her. I heard about Catherine. I'm sorry. Thank you. Mason gestured awkwardly to the only chair. Would you like to sit? She shook her head. I can't stay long. I just wanted to see you, make sure you're okay. David told me you took it hard. Mason was touched by her concern despite the strain between them. It was difficult, unexpected. We had to make some tough decisions at the end. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Before their relationship had deteriorated, she had been his closest confidant, the person he turned to with his doubts and fears. For a moment, he glimpsed the connection they had once shared. How long will you be here? He asked. 6 months. Maybe longer if the program takes hold. We're trying to restore basic services, give people a reason to reject the insurgency. She studied him. You look tired, Mason. It's been a long few weeks, he admitted, for all of us. I know. Sarah hesitated, then said, I'm not here to complicate things for you. I just thought it would be better if we talked, acknowledged the situation, rather than awkwardly avoiding each other in the mess hall. Mason appreciated her directness. It had always been one of her strengths, this ability to confront difficult truths head on. You're right. Thank you for coming by. She moved toward the door, then paused. Be careful out there, Mason. The city is more dangerous than the brass is admitting. We're hearing things on the civilian side that I'm not sure are making it up the military chain. What kinds of things? Mason asked, instantly alert to potential intelligence. The insurgents are organized, well-funded. They have a strategy beyond just killing Americans. They're fighting for control of the civilian population, using fear and religious authority. She met his eyes directly, and they're patient in a way we're not. The warning was sobering, coming as it did from someone with a different perspective on the conflict. I'll keep that in mind. And Sarah, you be careful too. These people don't distinguish between military and civilian targets. She gave him a small smile. I always am. That was always our difference, wasn't it? I'm careful. You do what you think is right, regardless of the risk. With that observation, both accurate and slightly barbed, she left, the door closing softly behind her. Mason sat heavily on his bunk, the unexpected encounter leaving him off balance. Having Sarah here added yet another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. Another person to worry about in the deadly environment of Fallujah. Morning came quickly, bringing with it final preparations for the mission. Mason arrived at the vehicle park to find Martinez already there, his left arm bearing a new scar, but otherwise looking fit and eager to return to duty. Martinez, Mason greeted him, clasping the young loader's hand. Good to have you back. Good to be back, sir, Martinez replied with a grin. Germany was boring. All they wanted me to do was rest and recover. I've been ready to rejoin the unit for weeks. Mason studied him, looking beyond the enthusiastic exterior. There was something different in Martinez's eyes, a loss of innocence perhaps, or a new awareness of mortality. Combat and injury changed a person, especially their first exposure to both. Thunderbolt wasn't the same without you, Mason told him, meaning it. The replacement they sent couldn't load the main gun half as fast. The compliment brought a wider smile to Martinez's face, but before he could respond, Rodriguez and Thompson arrived, completing their crew. Family reunion, Rodriguez observed, clapping Martinez on his good shoulder. The band's back together just in time for the big show. The big show was Operation Vigilant Resolve, the first major attempt to clear Fallujah of insurgents. Thunderbolt and the rest of the tank platoon would be supporting Marine infantry units as they moved into the city, providing firepower and, when necessary, using their armor to breach obstacles. Mason gathered his crew for a final briefing, ensuring everyone understood their role in the complex operation. This isn't like our previous engagement, he emphasized. We're moving into dense urban terrain against an enemy that's had time to prepare. They know the territory better than we do. They'll use that advantage. What's the ROE, sir? Thompson asked, referring to the rules of engagement that would govern their use of force. Restrictive, Mason admitted. We're trying to minimize civilian casualties. No firing the main gun without confirmed hostile intent. No demolishing structures without direct authorization. He looked at each of them in turn. It's going to require discipline and judgment. I'm counting on each of you to make the right calls under pressure. The men nodded, their expressions serious. They had all seen enough combat by now to understand the complexities of modern warfare, especially in an urban environment where enemy and civilian were often indistinguishable until it was too late. One more thing, Mason added. We look out for each other. No matter what happens out there, we stick together. Thunderbolt comes home intact, with all crew members. That's non-negotiable. Hooah, they responded in unison, using the Army affirmation that signified agreement and commitment. As they moved to their pre-combat checks, Mason took a moment to walk around Thunderbolt, inspecting the additional armor that had been added during his absence. The modifications were substantial, designed to protect against the IEDs that had become the insurgents' weapon of choice. But they also added weight, potentially affecting the tank's performance and maneuverability in tight spaces. She's heavier, but she'll protect us better, Thompson said, joining him in the inspection. The engineers did good work, tested it against the same kind of explosives they're finding in the IEDs. Mason nodded, trusting Thompson's assessment. The mechanic knew Thunderbolt better than anyone, could sense problems in the engine or systems before diagnostic equipment could detect them. Let's mount up, he ordered as the time for departure approached. We're third in the column. The four men climbed into their positions, each performing final checks on their equipment. Mason settled into the commander's cupola, adjusting his communications headset and ensuring his personal weapon was secure but accessible. Around them, the other tanks of the platoon were going through the same preparations, their engines coming to life with a synchronized roar. "Comms check," Mason ordered. "Gunner check," Rodriguez responded. "Loader check," Martinez confirmed. "Driver check." Thompson completed the sequence. "Thunderbolt is operational and ready," Mason reported to platoon command. "Roger that, Thunderbolt," Miller's voice came back over the radio. "Form up and prepare to move out. Stay alert. Intel reports increased activity in our AO." The column of tanks moved out, leaving the relative security of the forward operating base and heading toward the outskirts of Fallujah. The city spread before them, a maze of low buildings, minarets, and narrow streets. Smoke rose from several locations, evidence of earlier fighting or perhaps new strikes. The distant crack of small arms fire punctuated the otherwise eerie quiet. Mason felt the familiar tension of pre-combat, the heightened awareness of every sense, the coiled readiness in his muscles. But there was something else too, a deeper unease about this particular mission. Sarah's warning echoed in his mind. The insurgents are organized, well-funded. They have a strategy beyond just killing Americans. "All units be advised," Captain Westbrook's voice came over the command net. "We have reports of insurgents placing IEDs along the main approach routes. Advance with caution and maintain spacing between vehicles." The column slowed as they reached the city limits, the lead elements scanning for signs of buried explosives or ambush positions. Mason rotated in his cupola, using his optics to check rooftops and windows for snipers or RPG teams. "Movement, 2 o'clock. Rooftop," Rodriguez reported from his gunner's position. "Single individual with what looks like binoculars." "Observer," Mason concluded, focusing his own optics on the figure. "Probably reporting our position and strength to fighters further in the city." He switched to the command net. "Warhorse 6, Thunderbolt. We have a possible observer at grid coordinates Hotel 739er. Request permission to engage." "Negative, Thunderbolt," Miller responded after a brief pause. "Cannot confirm hostile intent. Continue to monitor." Mason acknowledged the order, understanding the constraints they were operating under, but frustrated nonetheless. The observer would be directing attacks against them soon enough, but without a weapon in hand, he wasn't considered a legitimate target. The column continued its cautious advance into the city, the tanks maintaining their protective formation around the Humvees and troop transports carrying the Marine infantry. The narrowing streets forced them to adjust, limiting their maneuverability and creating choke points that Mason knew would be exploited by the enemy. "Contact front!" The call came from the lead tank, accompanied immediately by the distinctive crack of an RPG launch. Mason saw the rocket streak toward the first tank in their column, striking its frontal armor and detonating in a flash of light and smoke. The Abrams composite armor did its job, absorbing the impact without penetration, but the message was clear. They had entered the kill zone. "All units, full combat posture," Captain Westbrook ordered over the command net. "Identify and engage hostile forces." Thunderbolt's crew shifted into the practice rhythm of combat operations. Rodriguez scanning for targets through his sophisticated sights, Martinez ready at the loading position, Thompson maintaining their position in the formation while navigating the increasingly debris-strewn streets. "RPG team, 9 o'clock, second floor window," Rodriguez called, his voice tense but controlled. "Confirmed hostile intent," Mason responded. She responded, making the critical determination that allowed them to engage. "Coax, fire when ready." Rodriguez depressed the trigger for the coaxial machine gun, sending a burst of 7.62mm rounds into the window. The insurgents inside disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris, the RPG they had been preparing to launch falling unfired. The next 30 minutes were a blur of movement, target identification, and controlled fire as the column pushed deeper into the insurgent-held neighborhood. The enemy was employing classic guerrilla tactics: strike, relocate, strike again from an unexpected direction. They used the urban terrain masterfully, appearing briefly to fire weapons before disappearing into buildings or alleyways too narrow for the tanks to follow. "This isn't working," Mason observed to his crew as they paused at an intersection, waiting for the infantry to clear buildings to their front. "They're bleeding us with 1,000 cuts, drawing us deeper into territory they know better than we do." "What's the alternative, LT?" Thompson asked. We can't just leave them in control of the city. Before Mason could respond, the radio crackled with urgency. All units, this is Bravo 6. We have a Marine fire team pinned down in a building at Grid Hotel 742, taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Need immediate support. Mason checked his map, locating the position. It was 2 blocks east of their current location, down streets that might be too narrow for Thunderbolt's width. Warhorse 6, Thunderbolt, he radioed to Miller. We can reach that position if we take the alley between buildings at our 3 o'clock. Permission to break formation and provide support. There was a pause as Miller considered the request. Breaking the carefully planned formation was risky, potentially exposing the tank to isolated attack. But Marines were in danger and time was critical. Thunderbolt Warhorse 6, permission granted. Be advised, that route hasn't been cleared. Proceed with extreme caution. Understood, Mason acknowledged. Then to his crew, Thompson, take us east through that alley. Rodriguez, maximum scan, all directions. Martinez, stand ready with heat rounds in case we need to breach. Roger that, they responded in sequence, the tension in their voices matching the gravity of the situation. Thompson maneuvered Thunderbolt away from the main column, the massive tank barely fitting between the buildings that lined the narrow alley. Debris crunched beneath their treads, and occasionally the sides of the tank scraped against walls, sending plaster and concrete dust into the air. This is tight, LT, Thompson warned. If we encounter a barricade, we might not be able to turn around. Understood. Keep going. Those Marines need us yesterday. They emerged from the alley into a small square, immediately drawing fire from insurgents positioned in surrounding buildings. Small arms rounds pinged harmlessly off Thunderbolt's armor, but the distinctive whoosh of an RPG launch signaled a more serious threat. Incoming, 3 o'clock, Rodriguez shouted. The rocket-propelled grenade streaked toward them, but Thompson's quick reaction, jerking the tank forward, caused it to miss its target, exploding against a wall behind them. Target identified, building to the right, 3rd floor, Rodriguez reported, swinging the main gun toward the threat. Heat round on my command, Mason ordered, assessing the situation. The building contained the RPG team, but could also house civilians. The restrictive rules of engagement required certainty before using the tank's devastating main gun. Another RPG team appeared on a rooftop, preparing to fire. This time, there was no doubt about their status as combatants. Main gun, rooftop target, fire when ready, Mason commanded. Rodriguez squeezed the trigger. The tank shuddered as the 120mm gun fired, the heat round streaking toward the rooftop and exploding with devastating force. The insurgents and their position disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. Target destroyed, Rodriguez confirmed. Movement at street level? 9 o'clock, Martinez called out, spotting what the others had missed from his loader's position. Looks like our Marines trying to reach better cover. Mason swiveled to see a group of 4 Marines darting from one doorway to another, under fire from insurgents in multiple positions. One of the Marines fell, hit by enemy fire. Thompson, get us between those Marines and the enemy fire. Rodriguez, suppress those shooters with the cokes. Thunderbolt surged forward, its 68 tons of armored mass providing a shield for the pinned-down Marines. Rodriguez unleashed a sustained burst from the coaxial machine gun, forcing the insurgent shooters to take cover. Marine team, this is Thunderbolt, Mason radioed on the infantry frequency. We're providing cover. Fall back to our position when ready. Roger that, Thunderbolt, came the breathless reply. We've got 1 man down. Need medevac. Understood. We'll get you out of here. The Marines moved quickly, using Thunderbolt's bulk as cover. 3 of them carried their wounded comrade, who appeared to be hit in the leg but still conscious. As they reached the relative safety behind the tank, Mason directed Thompson to begin a careful withdrawal, maintaining their protective position between the Marines and the insurgent fire. Warhorse 6, Thunderbolt, Mason radioed. We've reached the Marine team, 1 wounded requiring medevac. We're withdrawing to the rally point at Hotel 735. Request medical support on arrival. Copy that, Thunderbolt, Miller responded. Medical is standing by. Be advised, we're detecting increased insurgent movement in your sector. Possible attempt to cut off your withdrawal. Understood. We'll take alternate route, Charlie. Mason directed Thompson to take a different path back to the main force, avoiding the narrow alley they had used to reach the Marines. This route was longer but offered better maneuverability if they encountered resistance. The withdrawal was tense, with sporadic fire from insurgents who seemed to materialize from nowhere, take a few shots, and disappear again. Rodriguez engaged targets of opportunity with a coaxial machine gun, while Mason remained in constant communication with the Marine team moving alongside them. They were halfway back to the rally point when disaster struck. Thompson had just guided Thunderbolt around a tight corner when a massive explosion erupted beneath them, lifting the front of the tank partially off the ground before it crashed back down. IED, Thompson shouted, fighting to maintain control of the suddenly unresponsive vehicle. We've lost main power. The tank's systems flickered, some shutting down completely as the emergency backup power kicked in. Mason felt a moment of pure vulnerability, knowing they were now a stationary target in hostile territory. Status report, he demanded, already assessing options. Engine's dead, Thompson confirmed after checking his diagnostics. Hydraulics compromised. We're not moving under our own power. Weapon systems? Mason asked, turning to Rodriguez. Main gun operational on backup power. Coke still functional. Limited traverse capability. Martinez chimed in from the loader's position. Hull integrity holding. No penetration that I can detect. Mason made a quick decision. Rodriguez, maintain security with the coax. Thompson, see if you can get any systems back online. Martinez, help me establish a perimeter with the Marines. We need to hold this position until recovery arrives. He popped his hatch, surveying the situation from the commander's cupola. The Marine team had taken cover behind Thunderbolt and nearby debris, their wounded comrade propped against a wall as the corpsman worked on his leg. The street around them was momentarily quiet, but Mason could hear the sounds of firing in the distance, evidence that the battle for Fallujah was raging on multiple fronts. Sergeant, he called to the Marine team leader, a weathered NCO with a desert-tan face. What's your situation? 4 effectives, including me, the sergeant reported. 1 wounded, stable for now, but needs evacuation. We're low on ammo after the firefight. Mason nodded, appreciating the direct assessment. We're immobilized but still have firepower. I've called for recovery, but it may take time to reach us. We need to establish a defensive position and hold until help arrives. The sergeant looked around the urban battlefield, his experienced eyes evaluating the same tactical challenges Mason was considering. That building on the corner gives us good fields of fire in 3 directions. If we can get inside, we can secure it as a temporary strong point. Agreed. Mason turned to Martinez, who had joined him outside the tank. Stay with Thompson and Rodriguez. Keep Thunderbolt's guns operational. I'm going with the Marines to secure that building as our fallback position. Sir, Martinez protested, you should stay with the tank. I can go with the Marines. Mason understood the young loader's concern, but shook his head. I need you here. You know the tank systems better than I do. Help Thompson get her operational if possible. He grabbed his M4 carbine and extra magazines from his storage compartment, then joined the Marine sergeant and his 2 able-bodied men. Together they moved swiftly toward the corner building, covering each other as they crossed the exposed street. The structure was a 3-story apartment building, seemingly abandoned in the fighting. They entered cautiously, clearing rooms with practiced efficiency, finding no occupants but signs of hasty departure. Half-eaten meals, personal belongings scattered in the rush to escape the combat zone. Second floor gives us the best observation, the sergeant determined after a quick survey. Corporal Jenkins, set up there with the saw. Private Wilson, secure the ground floor entry points. I'll establish communication with command and check on Evans. Mason moved to a window position that gave him a clear view of Thunderbolt and the surrounding area. The disabled tank sat in the middle of the street, still an imposing presence despite its immobility. Martinez had returned inside, leaving Thompson working on the engine access panel, his tools spread around him as he attempted repairs. Thunderbolt, this is Sullivan, Mason radioed to his crew. Building is secure. What's your status? Still working on the engine, LT, Thompson's voice came back, strained with effort. Primary electrical system is fried, trying to jury-rig a bypass to get minimal mobility. Keep at it. We've established a defensive position in the building at your 10 o'clock. If the situation deteriorates, fall back to us. Roger that. Wait 1. There was a pause, then Thompson's voice returned with new urgency. Movement, multiple directions. Looks like they're setting up for an assault. Mason scanned the area, spotting what Thompson had seen. Insurgents were indeed moving into positions surrounding their location, using alleys and rooftops to approach from multiple angles. This wasn't random, it was coordinated, suggesting someone was directing a deliberate attack to capture or destroy the disabled American tank and its crew. All elements, prepare for contact, Mason ordered. Rodriguez, you have fire authority for clear threats. Marines, conserve ammunition. Take only shots you're sure of. The next moment stretched into a tense silence as both sides prepared for the coming clash. Mason used the time to radio their situation to command, requesting urgent support, but knowing it would take time to reach them, especially if the insurgents had deliberately chosen this location to isolate them from the main force. The attack, when it came, was surprisingly disciplined. Instead of the expected frontal assault, the insurgents began with a barrage of covering fire from multiple directions, attempting to pin down the defenders while their assault teams moved closer. They're trying to get close enough for RPM, the Marine sergeant observed. If they disable the tank's weapons, we're in serious trouble. Mason nodded grimly. Thunderbolt's armor could withstand small arms fire indefinitely, but its weapon systems were vulnerable, particularly with the tank stationary and operating on limited backup power. Rodriguez, he radioed. Priority targets are any RPG teams. Use the main gun if necessary. Roger that, the gunner responded. I have visual on 2 teams moving along the roofline at our 2 o'clock. Take them out. The tank's main gun elevated slightly, tracking the rooftop movement. When it fired, the sound was devastating even from Mason's position in the building. The heat round obliterated the section of rooftop where the insurgents had been positioned, sending a clear message about the consequences of approaching the wounded but still dangerous American war machine. The insurgents adjusted their tactics, focusing more fire on the building where Mason and the Marines had taken position. Bullets shattered windows and thudded into walls, forcing them to keep low and limit their return fire. They're probing for weaknesses, the sergeant said during a brief lull, testing our fields of fire, looking for blind spots. Mason agreed with the assessment. They want the tank, and they know they have to neutralize us first. He checked his watch. It had been 35 minutes since he'd called for recovery. Help should be on the way, but the narrow streets and ongoing combat throughout the city could delay its arrival. A new sound joined the cacophony of battle, the distinctive mechanical growl of Thunderbolt's turbine engine attempting to start. Thompson had managed to get some systems back online. Thunderbolt, this is Sullivan, Mason radioed hopefully. Status? We've got partial power, Thompson reported, excitement evident despite the strain in his voice. Limited mobility, maybe 5 miles per hour max. Better than nothing. Outstanding work. Stand by for extraction plan. Mason turned to the Marine sergeant. If we can get Thunderbolt moving, even slowly, we might be able to break out of this encirclement. But we'll need covering fire to keep the RPG team suppressed. The sergeant nodded. We can provide that. What about Evans? He gestured to their wounded comrade, who was conscious but clearly in no condition to move quickly. We'll load him onto the tank, Mason decided. It's his best chance. They quickly formulated a plan. The Marines would provide covering fire while Mason returned to Thunderbolt. Once there, they would bring the tank as close to the building as possible, load the wounded Marine, then begin a fighting withdrawal toward the rally point where recovery and medical support waited. Mason prepared to make the dash back to his vehicle, checking his weapon and mentally mapping the route that would offer the most cover. On my mark, he told the Marines, 3, 2, 1, go. He burst from the building entrance, running in a low crouch as the Marines opened fire from their positions, suppressing the insurgents who immediately tried to target him. Bullets kicked up dust at his feet and pinged off nearby surfaces, but none found their mark as he reached Thunderbolt and scrambled up its side to the commander's hatch. Good to have you back, sir, Martinez greeted him as he dropped into his position. Thompson's got the engine running, but it's not happy. It doesn't need to be happy, just functional, Mason replied, immediately reasserting command. Thompson, bring us alongside that building. Rodriguez, maintain suppressive fire on any visible threats. Martinez, prepare to assist loading a wounded Marine. Thunderbolt lurched forward, moving painfully slowly compared to its usual agile power, but moving nonetheless. Thompson guided it carefully to the building entrance, where the Marines were already bringing their wounded comrade down to ground level. Cover their extraction, Mason ordered, as Rodriguez swiveled the coaxial machine gun, laying down a steady stream of fire that kept the insurgents pinned down. The Marines emerged from the building, half carrying, half dragging their wounded man. Mason and Martinez helped pull him up onto the tank's hull, securing him as best they could against the turret. The remaining Marines climbed aboard as well, clinging to handholds on the exterior armor. Everyone's aboard, Mason confirmed. Thompson, get us out of here. Best speed toward the rally point. Thunderbolt began its agonizingly slow retreat, the damaged engine protesting but responding to Thompson's skilled handling. The insurgents, realizing their prey was escaping, intensified their attacks, bullets raining against the armor and occasionally coming dangerously close to the exposed Marines. RPG, 3 o'clock, one of the Marines shouted, spotting a team setting up for a shot. Rodriguez swiveled the main gun with the last of their hydraulic pressure, firing a final heat round that demolished the building section where the RPG team had been preparing to fire. The explosion bought them precious seconds as they continued their withdrawal. The journey to the rally point, which would normally have taken minutes, stretched into a half-hour ordeal of sporadic firefights, mechanical uncertainty, and constant vigilance. But finally, the welcome sight of American armor came into view. A recovery vehicle and 2 M1 tanks from another platoon sent to extract them. "Thunderbolt, this is Warhorse 6. Miller's voice came over the radio, relief evident despite his professional tone. "Good to see you in one piece. Medical is standing by for your passenger." "Roger that, Warhorse 6, Mason responded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Good to see you too." As they reached the safety of the American lines, medical personnel immediately moved to attend to the wounded Marine. Mason and his crew dismounted from the damaged Thunderbolt, watching as recovery specialists began assessing the tank's condition. "She'll need a complete electrical overhaul," Thompson said, patting the armored hull affectionately despite his exhaustion. "But she did her job. Got us home." Captain Westbrook approached, his expression a mixture of concern and approval. "Hell of a situation you found yourselves in, Sullivan. Your crew performed admirably." "Thank you, sir," Mason replied, standing straighter despite his fatigue. "They're the best." "We're pulling back to regroup," Westbrook informed him. "The whole operation is being reassessed. This city is proving harder to clear than anyone anticipated." Mason nodded, recalling Sarah's warning about the insurgents' organization and patience. She had been right. This was a different kind of fight, one that wouldn't be won by conventional tactics alone. As the adrenaline of combat began to fade, the events of the past weeks crashed over Mason in waves. Catherine's death, the tentative reconnection with his father, the unexpected appearance of Sarah, and now this brutal urban battle with its unclear objectives and elusive enemy. Each piece added weight to the burden of command, testing his resilience and resolve. But looking at his crew, Thompson's quiet competence, Rodriguez's steady courage, Martinez's youthful determination, Mason found renewed purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead in Fallujah, whatever personal struggles he faced, these men depended on him. And in a strange way, he depended on them too. Their bond forged in the crucible of combat becoming something that transcended military hierarchy. "Get some rest," he told them as they headed toward the temporary quarters set up at the rally point. "We'll debrief in an hour." As his crew moved away, Mason remained beside Thunderbolt, placing a hand on its battle-scarred armor. The tank was more than a weapon, more than a vehicle. It had become a symbol of their shared experience, their collective survival against increasingly difficult odds. Sergeant Miller approached, his expression unreadable, as he studied both Mason and the damaged tank. "You did good out there, Lieutenant," he said finally. "Kept your head, made the right calls, brought your people home." Coming from Miller, with his initial skepticism about Mason's leadership, the words carried special weight. "Thank you, Sergeant." Miller nodded, then added, "Your father would be proud." This time, the reference to James Sullivan didn't sting as it once would have. Instead, Mason felt a quiet acceptance. Perhaps there was value in being part of a legacy, as long as you found your own way to fulfill it. As the sun began to set over Fallujah, casting long shadows across the contested city, Mason knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new risks. The war was changing, becoming something more complex and ambiguous than what they had trained for. But he would face it with clarity of purpose, drawing strength from the bonds of loyalty that had been tested and proven in the fires of combat. In the gathering dusk, with the sounds of distant fighting, a constant reminder of the ongoing struggle, Mason Sullivan stood at the crossroads of duty and identity, of military legacy and personal choice. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with danger and difficult choices. But for the first time since donning the uniform, he felt truly comfortable in his role, not as James Sullivan's son, but as Lieutenant Mason Sullivan, commander of Thunderbolt, leader of men. 5 years after returning from Iraq, Mason Sullivan stood at the window of his downtown Houston apartment, watching the early morning traffic begin to build on the streets below. At 47, he still maintained the physical discipline of his military days, though his morning runs were now more about maintaining sanity than combat readiness. His dark hair had started to gray at the temples, adding a distinguished quality that matched the intensity that remained in his blue eyes. The apartment was sparsely furnished but comfortable, more of a way station than a home. After 12 years of military service and 3 combat deployments, Mason had found civilian life to be an ongoing adjustment, a series of attempts to translate his experiences and skills into something meaningful in a world that often seemed trivial by comparison. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Checking the screen, he saw it was Jake, his son, calling from college. A complicated feeling rose in Mason's chest, the familiar mix of pride and regret that characterized their relationship. "Morning, Jake," he answered, trying to keep his tone light. "You're up early." "Dad, did you see the email I sent you?" Jake's voice held an excitement that Mason had rarely heard directed at him in recent years. "Professor Brennan wants to use your interview as part of our media studies course. Says it's one of the best first-person accounts of modern warfare he's ever heard." Mason smiled despite himself. His podcast, Steel Tracks, had started as a personal project, a way to process his experiences and connect with other veterans. In its first year, it had grown beyond anything he had anticipated, reaching thousands of listeners and becoming an unexpected bridge between the military and civilian worlds. "That's great," he said, genuinely pleased. "Tell him I'm happy to talk to your class if he wants a follow-up." "Really? That would be awesome." Jake paused, then added, "I've been listening to more episodes. The one with your gunner, Rodriguez? It's intense, Dad. I had no idea what you guys went through over there." The comment struck Mason deeply. For years after his return, he had struggled to communicate with Jake about his experiences. His son had been 10 when Mason's final deployment ended, and 14 when the divorce from Sarah was finalized. Those critical years of adolescence had passed with Mason present physically, but often absent emotionally. Struggling with his transition to civilian life while working long hours at Continental Supply Chain Management, a job that utilized his logistical experience but left him feeling hollow. "There was a lot I couldn't talk about back then," Mason admitted, "not just because it was classified, but because I didn't have the words for it." He hesitated, then asked, "Are you sure you're okay listening to all that? Some of it gets pretty dark." "I'm not a kid anymore, Dad. I'm 23, remember?" There was a hint of the old defensiveness in Jake's voice, but it faded quickly. "Actually, the podcast helps me understand some things about why you were the way you were when you came back." Mason felt a surge of emotion that he carefully controlled, the old military discipline of containing feelings still reflexive after all these years. "I'm glad it helps. I wish I'd found a better way to explain it all back then." "It's cool. We're talking now, right?" Jake's tone suggested a tentative peace offering. "Anyway, I should get to class. Just wanted to let you know about Professor Brennan." "Thanks for calling. And Jake, I'm proud of you." Mason said it simply, directly, the way he wished he'd been able to say many things over the years. "Thanks, Dad. Talk to you later." After ending the call, Mason moved to his home office where the equipment for his podcast was set up in one corner. The walls were decorated with photographs, his tank crew in Iraq, his father in his dress uniform, a recent picture of Jake at his college graduation. The most prominent was a framed poster for Steel Tracks, professionally designed by a listener who worked in marketing and had reached out after being moved by an early episode. Mason sat at his desk reviewing the notes for today's interview with a former tank commander from the 1st Armored Division who had served in Afghanistan. The conversation would focus on leadership under extreme conditions, a topic Mason had explored from multiple angles since launching the podcast 2 years ago. His laptop chimed with an incoming email. It was from Tommy "Doc" Martinez, his former loader, now working as a physical therapist, specializing in veteran rehabilitation in San Antonio. The message was brief. "Hey LT, just heard from Wrench. He's having a rough time. PTSD flaring up bad. Might be worth reaching out. He always listened to you." Mason frowned, concern immediately overriding his other thoughts. Mike Wrench Thompson had been the rock of their crew, the steady, reliable presence who kept Thunderbolt operational through the worst conditions. After leaving the Army, he had returned to his hometown in Michigan, working as a mechanic and seemingly adjusting well to civilian life. But Mason knew from experience that PTSD could lie dormant for years before something triggered a crisis. He reached for his phone, then hesitated. A text or call might be too easily ignored if Thompson was truly struggling. Instead, he checked the calendar on his wall. The interview scheduled for today couldn't be postponed. The guest was flying in from Colorado specifically for it, But afterward, there was nothing that couldn't be rearranged. Mason made a quick decision, booking a flight to Detroit for the following morning. Some things took priority over everything else, and the bond with his former crew was at the top of that list. Whatever Thompson was going through, he wouldn't face it alone. The interview that afternoon went well, the former officer sharing insights about command decisions that resonated with Mason's own experiences. They talked for nearly 2 hours, covering topics from tactical challenges to the ethical dilemmas of modern warfare. Throughout, Mason guided the conversation with the skill he had developed over dozens of similar interviews, knowing when to probe deeper and when to allow reflective silence. After his guest departed, Mason quickly edited the audio, preparing it for release the following week. As he worked, his mind kept returning to Thompson. They had stayed in touch sporadically over the years, exchanging occasional messages and once meeting up when Mason was in Detroit for a business trip. Thompson had seemed solid then, perhaps a bit quieter than during their service, but stable. What had changed? What had triggered this current crisis? The questions nagged at Mason as he finished his work and packed a small bag for the trip to Michigan. The next morning, as his flight prepared for departure, Mason found himself staring at the weather radar on his phone screen, watching a line of thunderstorms moving across the Midwest. The familiar pre-mission focus settled over him, the mental shifting of priorities and contingencies that had once been second nature. Except this wasn't a mission, not officially. This was personal, a response to a bond forged in circumstances most civilians would never understand. Yet Mason approached it with the same methodical attention he had once given to combat operations, gathering information, planning his approach, preparing for variables. The flight to Detroit was bumpy but otherwise uneventful. Mason rented a car at the airport and drove north toward Traverse City, where Thompson had settled after leaving the service. The landscape gradually transformed from urban sprawl to the rolling hills and forests of northern Michigan, the early autumn colors beginning to emerge among the trees. Thompson's home was on the outskirts of town, a modest ranch house with a large detached garage that he had converted into a workshop. As Mason pulled into the gravel driveway, he noticed the property had a slightly neglected appearance. The lawn overgrown, a gutter hanging loose along one edge of the roof. He parked and approached the front door, knocking firmly. There was no immediate response, though he could hear movement inside. Mason waited, knocking again after a minute. Finally, the door opened, revealing Mike Thompson. The years had changed him more than Mason had expected. Though still physically imposing at 6'3", Thompson had lost weight, his frame appearing almost gaunt beneath a stained t-shirt. His eyes, once alert and observant, now held a wary, haunted quality that Mason recognized all too well. "Lieutenant?" Thompson's voice held disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Not a lieutenant anymore, Wrench," Mason replied with a slight smile. "Just Mason now, and I was in the neighborhood." Thompson's expression suggested he wasn't buying the casual explanation, but he stepped back from the doorway. "Come in, I guess. Place is a mess." The interior of the house reflected the same neglect as the exterior. Dishes were piled in the sink, mail and papers scattered across the coffee table. The air held the stale odor of a space that hadn't been properly ventilated in some time. "You want coffee?" Thompson asked, moving toward the kitchen. "Think I've got some clean mugs somewhere." "Coffee would be great," Mason agreed, following him. He watched as Thompson moved around the kitchen, his actions mechanical, lacking the efficient precision that had once characterized everything he did. "Martinez contacted you, didn't he?" Thompson asked abruptly, his back to Mason as he filled the coffee maker. "He's concerned. So am I now that I'm here." Mason kept his tone matter of fact, neither accusing nor pitying. "What's going on, Mike?" Thompson's shoulders tensed, then sagged. "Nothing I can't handle. Like you handled that coolant leak in Thunderbolt when we were stranded? Solo? Without asking for help?" Mason countered, referring to the incident in Fallujah when they'd almost been overrun. The reference hit home. Thompson turned, his expression a mix of irritation and reluctant acknowledgement. "That was different." "Was it?" Mason moved to the kitchen table, clearing a space among the clutter and sitting down. "We were a crew then. Still are, as far as I'm concerned." Thompson didn't respond immediately, focusing on the coffee preparation with unnecessary attention. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower. "Been having the dreams again. Bad ones. Can't sleep, can't focus at work. Had to take leave before I screwed up somebody's engine beyond repair." Mason nodded, recognizing the symptoms. "What triggered it?" "Anniversary of Miller's death. 5 years now." Thompson poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one before Mason before taking the opposite chair. Got me thinking about all of it, about who made it home and who didn't, about whether what we did over there made any difference in the end. Sergeant Frank Miller, their former platoon sergeant, had been killed during Mason's third deployment to Afghanistan. Though initially skeptical of Mason's leadership, Miller had become a trusted mentor, especially after the Fallujah operations. His death in an IED attack had hit the entire platoon hard. "I've been asking myself those same questions for years," Mason admitted. "Don't have perfect answers yet, but I know one thing made a difference. What we did for each other, the lives we saved, including each other's." Thompson stared into his coffee. "You ever feel like you left the best parts of yourself over there? Like the person who came home isn't really you anymore?" The question resonated deeply with Mason, articulating a sense of disconnection he had struggled with since his return. "All the time, took me years to realize I wasn't going to get that old self back. Had to build something new instead." "How'd you do it?" Thompson's question was simple but profound. "Not easily, not quickly." Mason took a sip of his coffee, organizing his thoughts. "The podcast helped. Talking to other vets, hearing their stories, realizing I wasn't alone in feeling lost. But before that, I nearly drove Sarah away completely. Nearly lost Jake for good. Spent years in a job I hated because I didn't know what else I was good for." The admission seemed to surprise Thompson. "You always seem to have it together, LT, even in the worst situations." Mason shook his head. "That was the job. Had to project confidence for the crew, even when I was terrified inside. Carried that habit into civilian life. Kept the struggles private. Tried to handle everything alone. Worst mistake I could have made." They talked for hours, the conversation moving from Thompson's current struggles to shared memories of Iraq to the challenges of civilian transition. As the afternoon light began to fade, Mason finally addressed the reason for his visit directly. "You need help, Mike. Professional help, not just a visit from an old commander." Thompson tensed but didn't immediately reject the suggestion. "VA's a nightmare to deal with. I know people, good people, who specialize in combat veterans. One of the benefits of doing the podcast is I've connected with resources all over the country." Mason pulled out his phone. "There's a program in Grand Rapids, about 2 hours from here. Outpatient, so you wouldn't have to relocate. I can make a call, get you in this week." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible in the set of his jaw and the way his hands gripped his empty coffee mug. Finally, he nodded once, a short, sharp movement. "Okay, make the call." Relief washed through Mason, though he kept his expression neutral. "I'll stay a few days, help you get things organized here before you start the program." "You don't have to do that," Thompson protested. "You've got your own life back in Houston. Nothing that can't wait." Mason stood, moving to the sink with his mug. "Besides, I owe you. Thunderbolt would have been scrap metal a dozen times over without your mechanical wizardry." A ghost of a smile touched Thompson's face. "We had some close calls, didn't we?" "Too many to count," Mason agreed. "But we made it through. We'll make it through this too." Over the next 3 days, Mason helped Thompson clean up his house, paid overdue bills that had been piling up, and drove him to the initial assessment at the treatment center in Grand Rapids. The program was comprehensive, combining therapy, medication management, and peer support specifically tailored for combat veterans. The intake counselor, a former Marine with a quiet, competent manner, assured Thompson that his experiences were not uncommon and that the program had high success rates with similar cases. On the 4th day, as Mason prepared to return to Houston, Thompson walked him to his rental car. "I don't know how to thank you for this," Thompson said awkwardly. "Showing up, getting me into the program, all of it." "No thanks needed." Mason put his bag in the trunk, then turned to face his former crew member. "Just keep in touch. Let me know how you're doing, and when you're ready, I'd like to have you on the podcast. Your perspective would mean a lot to other vets going through the same thing." Thompson looked surprised. "You think anyone would want to hear what I have to say?" "I know they would. That's what I've learned doing this. Everyone's story matters, especially the hard ones." Mason extended his hand. "Think about it. No pressure, but the invitation's open whenever you're ready." They shook hands, the gesture evolving into a brief, firm embrace. As Mason drove away, he watched Thompson in the rearview mirror, standing straighter than he had been when Mason arrived, the first step in a long road to recovery, but a crucial one. The experience with Thompson stayed with Mason during his flight home, prompting a re-examination of his own journey since leaving the military. The podcast had begun as a personal project, a way to process his experiences through conversations with other veterans. But it had evolved into something larger, a platform that connected service members across generations and helped bridge the civilian-military divide. Yet he had kept it deliberately small scale, a side project while he maintained his corporate job at Continental Supply Chain Management. The position paid well and utilized some of his military logistics experience, but left him feeling unfulfilled, a cog in a corporate machine focused on quarterly profits rather than meaningful impact. Landing in Houston, Mason checked his messages to find one from Rodriguez, who now worked as a police officer in San Antonio. "Heard you went to see Wrench. Good call, LT. Thinking we should get the crew together soon. It's been too long." The suggestion resonated, another piece falling into place in Mason's evolving thoughts. By the time he reached his apartment, a decision had been forming, crystallizing from ideas that had been percolating for months. The next morning, Mason requested a meeting with his supervisor at Continental. Harold Benson was a reasonable manager who had always respected Mason's military background, even if he didn't fully understand it. "I'm resigning, Harold," Mason said without preamble once they were seated in Benson's office. "I appreciate all the opportunities Continental has given me, but it's time for me to move in a different direction." Benson looked genuinely surprised. "This is unexpected, Mason. Is it a better offer? Because we could talk about advancement opportunities. Maybe look at the operations director position that's opening up next quarter." Mason shook his head. "It's not about advancement or compensation. I need to focus on something that matters more to me personally." He explained briefly about the podcast, about its growth and potential impact. "I've been doing it on the side, but it deserves my full attention. There are too many veterans struggling out there, too many stories that need to be told." To his credit, Benson didn't dismiss the idea as impractical or idealistic. "Sounds like you've found a calling. Can't say I'm happy to lose you, but I understand pursuing something meaningful." He extended his hand across the desk. "I hope it works out, Sullivan. And if it doesn't, there's always a place for you here." "I appreciate that." Mason shook his hand, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders with the decision made official. The next weeks were a flurry of activity as Mason transformed his part-time podcast into a full-fledged operation. He invested some of his savings in better equipment, built a proper website, and reached out to his growing network of veterans and military contacts to schedule interviews. He also expanded the format, adding episodes that address specific challenges of military transition, PTSD resources, and veteran benefits navigation. 2 months after his visit to Thompson, Mason received an unexpected call from Sarah. They had maintained a cordial if distant relationship since their divorce, connected primarily through Jake and occasional professional interactions when her USAID work overlapped with veteran issues. "I hear you've gone full-time with the podcast," she said after the initial pleasantries. "Jake's been talking about it nonstop. Says you're building something important." "Trying to," Mason acknowledged, surprised and touched by Jake's apparent enthusiasm. "It's a leap of faith, but it feels right. That's why I'm calling, actually." Sarah's tone shifted to something more professional. "USAID is launching a new initiative focused on veteran engagement in international development. We're looking for partners to help get the word out to the veteran community. Your platform would be perfect." The proposal was unexpected but intriguing. What exactly would this partnership involve? Initially just featuring information about the program on your podcast, maybe interviewing some veterans who've worked with us internationally. Eventually, if things go well, potentially a more formal role as a consultant or program advisor. She paused. "I thought of you immediately when the initiative came up. You understand both worlds." Mason considered the offer. Working with Sarah would be complicated given their history, but the opportunity to connect veterans with meaningful international service aligned perfectly with his goals for the podcast. "I'd like to hear more details," he said finally. "Why don't we meet to discuss it properly?" They arranged to meet at a coffee shop the following week. As Mason ended the call, he realized it was the first genuine professional conversation he and Sarah had shared since their divorce. Perhaps this new chapter in his life could also help heal some old wounds, or at least transform them into something constructive. The meeting with Sarah proved productive, leading to a collaboration that benefited both the podcast and the USAID initiative. Over the following months, Steel Tracks continued to grow, attracting listeners not only among veterans, but also military families, policymakers, and civilians interested in understanding the realities of modern warfare and its aftermath. Thompson completed his treatment program successfully and, true to Mason's prediction, eventually agreed to appear on the podcast. His candid discussion of PTSD and recovery became one of the most downloaded episodes, generating messages from veterans across the country who recognized their own struggles in his story. As the first anniversary of Mason's full-time commitment to the podcast approached, he organized a special live recording at a veterans center in Houston. The event brought together former military members from multiple generations, from Vietnam veterans to recent Afghanistan returnees, creating connections across eras and experiences. After the recording, as the audience mingled and conversed, Mason found himself standing slightly apart, observing the community that had formed around what had begun as his personal project. "Quite a turnout," a familiar voice commented beside him. Mason turned to see his father, Colonel James Sullivan, now fully retired and showing his 70 years in the slight stoop of his shoulders and the deep lines around his eyes. "Dad," Mason greeted him, surprised but pleased. "I didn't know you were coming. You should have told me." "Wanted to see this operation of yours without any special treatment," the colonel replied, his gaze taking in the room. "It's impressive what you've built here." The simple compliment meant more to Mason than elaborate praise from anyone else would have. Just trying to help people make sense of their experiences, give them a platform to tell their stories. His father nodded thoughtfully. "You know, in my day, we didn't talk about these things. Came home, put the war away, moved on. At least that's what we told ourselves we were doing." He looked directly at Mason. "Your approach is better, healthier." "Learned that the hard way," Mason admitted. "Tried the put it away and move on method first. Nearly cost me everything that mattered." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the diverse group of veterans connecting across generational and experiential lines. "Your grandfather would have understood what you're doing here," the colonel said finally. "He never talked much about Europe, but he kept in touch with his tank crew his whole life. Drove your grandmother crazy, having these old soldiers showing up at all hours, drinking coffee at the kitchen table, talking in their own private language." Mason smiled at the image, this glimpse of a family history he hadn't heard before. "I didn't know that. Lot of things I should have told you," his father acknowledged. "Maybe I still can, if you're interested. Might even make a good episode for your podcast someday. The Sullivan Men and Their Tanks, 3 generations of service." The suggestion held an olive branch, an opportunity to explore their shared history in a new context. "I'd like that," Mason said simply. As the evening wound down, Jake approached, having arrived late from a class at his graduate school. The young man greeted his grandfather respectfully before turning to Mason. "This was amazing, Dad," he said, genuine enthusiasm in his voice. "The way these different generations were connecting, finding common ground. I've never seen anything like it." "It exceeded my expectations too," Mason admitted. "Turns out when you give people a chance to tell their authentic stories, others respond." Jake hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about what comes next for me after graduation. Been considering journalism, maybe specifically military and veteran affairs." He glanced around the room. "Seeing this, hearing these stories, it matters. Someone needs to make sure they're told properly." Mason felt a surge of pride in something else, a sense of continuity, of values transmitted across generations, even as the specific expression of those values evolved. Not tanks and direct combat service, but still a commitment to the military community. Still a form of service. "You'd be good at that," he told his son. "You've got the intelligence for it, and the empathy." Jake seemed pleased by the assessment. "Actually, I was wondering, would you consider taking on an intern for the summer? Someone to help with research, maybe learn the interview techniques? The podcast's getting big enough that you could probably use the help." The request caught Mason by surprise, but a good one. "You're interested in working with the podcast?" "If you'd be open to it," Jake confirmed. "Think of it as a professional apprenticeship. Plus, we could make up for some of that time we lost when I was a teenager and you were trying to figure out civilian life." The offer contained both professional interest and personal reconciliation, a chance to strengthen their rebuilding relationship while sharing meaningful work. "I'd be honored to have you on board," Mason said simply, meaning every word. Later that night, after the event had concluded and the guests departed, Mason returned to his apartment with a sense of satisfaction deeper than anything he had experienced in his corporate career. The podcast was making a difference in veterans' lives, creating connections where isolation had existed, offering a platform for stories that needed to be told and heard. Moreover, it had become a vehicle for healing his own fragmented relationships with his father, with Jake, even to some extent with Sarah through their professional collaboration. The mission had evolved from personal processing to community building, from individual therapy to collective support. Mason settled at his desk, making notes for upcoming episodes. His phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez. "Great event tonight, LT. Wrench says thanks too. Martinez has an idea for a special episode on medical personnel in combat zones. Says he'll call you tomorrow." The message brought a smile to Mason's face, evidence that his former crew remained connected not just to him, but to each other and to the larger mission of the podcast. They had gone from protecting each other in combat to supporting each other in civilian life. The bond transformed but unbroken. His computer chimed with an incoming email. Opening it, Mason found a message from a production company in Los Angeles. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm a producer with Horizon Films. We've been following Steel Tracks with great interest and believe your approach to veteran stories would translate powerfully to documentary format. We'd like to discuss the possibility of developing a film based on your work and personal story as a tank commander turned podcaster. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to explore this opportunity." Mason read the message twice, considering its implications. A documentary could reach an even wider audience, bringing these important stories to people who might never listen to a podcast. But it would also mean greater exposure, putting himself more directly in the spotlight than he had been comfortable with in the past. He closed the email without responding immediately, deciding to sleep on the decision. Whatever choice he made would need to serve the core mission, supporting veterans, bridging the civilian-military divide, ensuring that the sacrifices and struggles of service members were understood and honored. The next morning, Mason rose early for his usual run, the rhythm of his feet on the pavement creating the familiar meditative state that helped him process complex thoughts. By the time he returned to his apartment, the decision had clarified in his mind. He would explore the documentary opportunity, but with conditions. The film would need to focus on multiple veterans' stories, not just his own. It would need to avoid both glorification and pity, presenting the complex realities of military service and its aftermath honestly. And most importantly, it would need to offer resources and hope to veterans watching, not just entertainment for civilian audiences. As Mason showered and prepared for his day, his thoughts turned to the upcoming podcast episode, an interview with a female tank commander who had served in Afghanistan. Each conversation added another thread to the tapestry he was weaving, another perspective that enriched understanding of the military experience. His phone rang. Jake calling to discuss details of their summer internship arrangement. The conversation was easy, their relationship now on more solid ground than it had been in years. As they talked through possible projects and learning objectives, Mason felt a sense of continuity and purpose that had often eluded him since leaving active duty. Later that afternoon, Mason sat in his recording studio preparing for the interview. As he adjusted his equipment and reviewed his notes, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. From the young lieutenant determined to escape his father's shadow, to the tank commander leading men in combat, to the struggling civilian trying to find his place, to the podcast host creating a platform for veteran voices, each phase had been necessary. Each challenge had shaped who he was becoming. The Steel Commander had transformed, trading his armored vehicle for a microphone, his crew for a broader community, his tactical objectives for a strategic mission of connection and understanding. Yet the core values remained: courage, commitment, integrity, and above all, service to something larger than himself. As his guest arrived and they began the interview, Mason guided the conversation with the same care he had once directed Thunderbolt through dangerous terrain. Different tools, different context, but the same focused attention, the same determination to accomplish the mission while protecting what mattered most. "Tell me about your first day commanding a tank," he invited his guest, opening the door to another story that needed to be told, another experience that would help listeners understand the realities of modern warfare and its aftermath. And as she began to speak, Mason Sullivan listened intently. No longer just a former tank commander, no longer just a podcaster, but a bridge between worlds, a translator of experiences, a steward of stories that might otherwise go untold. The mission continued, different from what he had imagined when he first donned the uniform, but no less vital, no less meaningful. Not the path he had originally envisioned, but one that utilized all he had learned in ways he could never have anticipated. This was his new command, his new purpose. And in it, he had finally found not just what he was good at, but what he was meant for.